We must now prepare for a negotiation with the European Union.
We are determined to keep our unity as 27.
It was a noble idea for its time. It is no longer right for this country.
Welcome back to this Newsmakers special episode, live from London. Just behind me, I'm on the south bank of the Thames, overlooking Big Ben. It's just struck 7:30. The sun begins to set on an extraordinary day for Britain, an extraordinary moment in history. Now, there's so many questions being asked right now. Just how does this happen? How does this work? Britain might have filed for divorce, but the lawyers need to do the paperwork with the European Union now. What is Article 50 and what is the process once you have decided to break away from the European Union? Christine Perovalakis explains.
Britons may have voted out of the EU, but the road to independence from the bloc is long and winding. The UK is the first nation state to leave the EU, preceded only by the Danish territory of Greenland, which voted out in 1982. To set the wheels in motion, the UK Prime Minister will need to activate Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. But it's unclear when this will happen. The treaty says that in case of an exit, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state, setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union.
A negotiation with the European Union will need to begin under a new Prime Minister.
These negotiations have a 2-year deadline before the UK's divorce from the bloc is complete. But the fallout from the split is already starting to show. Since the Brexit was announced, the pound has fallen to a shattering 30-year low. And more than £100 billion has been wiped off British shares. Economists in the Leave camp say this won't last long. But now the UK will have to start negotiating its access to the EU single market and open its economy to trade with the rest of the world. But it'll also mean much more competition from low-cost countries. If they fail to strike a deal, UK GDP could fall by as much as 2.2% by 2030. But Believers say if it's smooth sailing into a liberal trade arrangement, GDP could actually go up by as much as 1.6% by then. And during the 2-year negotiation process, the UK has to keep paying its EU contributions. Cameron has announced his resignation and intends to step down by October. And while EU leaders try to remain optimistic,
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
that wave now threatens to wash over the rest of the bloc as the sun sets on a historic union.
Well, joining us now is Alex Deane, the former Chief of Staff to David Cameron, and still with us is Denis MacShane, the former UK Minister of State for Europe. Alex, on both sides of the political spectrum, many Tories, many Labour Party members as well, would see Prime Minister David Cameron's decision to call for this vote as one of the biggest blunders in modern political history. He himself would probably regret calling for that referendum. Now it's cost him his job. You do not. Why?
I don't. Well, it was a matter of internal Tory party management. I mean, that's really why he called the referendum. I nevertheless think that it was a good thing that we had the votes. So from my perspective, it's not to be regretted or lamented. It's in fact great that our country had the first opportunity since 1975 to express frankly what we thought about our membership of the European Union. And boy, didn't that get heard. But let's not pretend that's the reason the Prime Minister called the referendum. He called it to try to squeeze UKIP out from his right flank when he wanted to fight the 2015 election. And on that, at least, I think Denis and I will agree.
So he messed up?
I think it was a mistake.
From his perspective?
It was absolutely a mistake in party management purposes and political purposes. It wasn't wrong to hold the referendum in principle. In fact, it was profoundly right to have it. That wasn't his intention, but that's what was achieved.
Have you seen some of the clips now of people regretting their vote, wondering what they've done? The Google search trends, people asking after the vote, what is the EU? What does it mean to leave the EU?
Look,
The question I want to ask is, might a lot of people not have thought this through fully?
You sit 33 million people voted, and if the attitude that you have is that, not you personally, but if one's attitude is that people should just be dismissed because they got it wrong after the fact, why do we have elections? Yeah, like, why do we let people be elected the building behind us?
Yeah, but after general elections, people don't necessarily the morning after go, oh, I'm not so sure about my vote. This is why Germany doesn't have referendums, right?
Right.
Because they
the Swiss have them all the time, and we are somewhere in between and getting a bit more Swiss normally because the government thinks it'll entrench the status quo, which is normally right.
Let's gave the status quo a bloody nose, Dennis. That's the message we've got from both pro-Brexit guests here today. You can't disagree with them, right? Both in Brussels and here, people didn't seem to maybe take voters seriously.
Oh, for heaven's sake, if you're been elected as an MP, as I have for few elections, European immigration is constantly in your face. It was the first issue when I stood for Parliament aged 24, as indeed was Europe to some extent. No, Mrs. Thatcher said very clearly, referendums are a device of dictators and demagogues. Mr. Cameron is neither one nor the other, but he's made an historic error, which I think he will live to regret. It wasn't necessary to win the 2015 election. He's opened up a civil war in his party. I actually like David Cameron. Sorry, I'm Labour, but I like David Cameron personally. I wrote a book in 2015 saying how we will leave the European Union because I know my country.
And you were right.
Know my country, and the moment you unleash referendums, when I started life, we wanted referendums on capital punishment, on abortion. You could say, oh, we must have a referendum on this, that, and the other thing.
If your side had won, if we'd voted to stay in, and it had entrenched Britain's membership of the EU for a generation, or even two, then you'd be glad, wouldn't you?
No, not on the contrary. I always said the process will divide the nation as it has. It will cause great difficulties for the proper economic management of the country. It will damage politicians because in a referendum, the populists always win. Today's big winner is Nigel Farage.
Populists didn't win in the vote on Scottish independence, did they? The populist attitude in Scotland was, you know, throw out Westminster, show what you think of the English, and that was roundly defeated.
No, it wasn't that roundly defeated, and now Scotland has voted against the English. I've got texts from my Scottish cousins saying, that's it, the English once again are telling us who we have to be. Right. We're Scots. We want to stay with Europe. So that tension's going to play out. I don't know whether there'll be a referendum in Scotland or not. It's for other people to say and comment. We now are a more divided, a bitter and unhappy nation. There are kids up in Trafalgar Square crying, saying, how dare they take away our right to travel, live, work, study freely in Europe. It's
good that you both mentioned Scotland. We're going to go to it in just a moment. But Alex, looking at what happens next, Article 50, this sort of unwinding process, who's going to negotiate on Britain's behalf?
Well, the Conservative Party will elect a new leader in time for the party conference in October. As the Conservative Party has a majority in the House of Commons, that person will become our Prime Minister. I don't know who that will be yet, and we all can have our suspicions, and Boris Johnson will certainly run. He may well be the leading candidate, but he will be challenged. I have no doubt of that either. So the honest answer is one doesn't know yet. However, remember too, the Prime Minister doesn't have to be the person that goes and negotiates. This is going to be a lengthy process. This is going to be something that requires commitment, probably full-time. And on that basis, I think we ought to appoint a full-time negotiating team at ministerial level.
I'm available. I know Europe. I speak the languages. Juncker likes me.
When Alex said Boris Johnson, you sort of had this little wince.
Only because, again, I like Boris, but I think the language he used in this referendum, calling the Prime Minister a liar, demented, unworthy, never before have we seen that in England. Actual within the same party, obviously the left, the Labour Party, some nutty right-wingers. Boris, I think, has shown himself to be a populist, a Donald Trump, a bit of a clown. I'd be very surprised if he went through the sieve, because first of all, the Tory MPs have to decide final two candidates. But it's not for me to say, I'm not a Conservative. I just don't think Boris is a House of Commons man. And he may have kind of stabbed David Cameron in the front and the back, but he who wields the dagger doesn't necessarily wear the crown.
Let's talk money, Alex. Stock markets have been brutal today. Are you worried about that?
No, they haven't. No, they haven't. The stock market... do you want to talk to me or do you want to pull faces? The stock market is essentially back to where it was.
It's stable?
It's
gone down and went up.
It's gone down and it's gone up, and the pound is where it was against the dollar in February. This is not some great disaster. Now, you might have a better point to say, when we leave the EU, there might be greater economic impacts. Okay. But the suggestion that the market has kind of exploded is absurd.
are the fears that people have about the economy, with Britain breaking away from Europe, unfounded?
Well, part of the reason people have fears, with respect, is that people like you make statements like the statement you just made. The FTSE 100 is back to where it was last week. It's actually closed higher this Friday than it was last Friday. So when you say things have plummeted or crashed, people form their views in part because of you.
I said brutal.
People like you. Yes, well, okay. So brutal's better, is it, than crashed or plummeted?
It is a fascinating question whether once we're out fully, and Alex is right, we don't know about that just yet, whether, for example, all British firms lose what's called the single passport to trade anywhere, when investment starts to slow down, question marks, a bit more instability, the pound perhaps does go down a bit of a recession, people are laid off, that stops immigration very quickly, by the way. And at that point, there'll be some buyer's remorse, and people say, bloody hell, oh, sorry, they never told us it was going to be like this.
Okay, so I want to talk Scotland for the moment because we've got our Sarah Morice live for us in Glasgow. Sarah, 62% of Scots voted to stay in. Britain has decided to leave Europe. How's that decision gone down where you are?
Well, I think what started as shock this morning is probably bubbling towards anger, particularly here in Glasgow tonight. You know, every single council area here in Scotland did vote to remain. As you said, 62% of Scots wanted to stay here in the EU. So it's extraordinarily disappointing to wake up for them and find that their vote has really been steamrolled by the bigger countries, by, you know, England and Wales combining their voting power just meant that poor old Scotland's vote didn't really get heard, and therefore they just have to go along with the ride. Now, what it's doing here, I've noticed, is fueling a really anti-London and anti-England sort of sentiment. We're standing in the main square here in Glasgow tonight, and we've just witnessed a protest. You know, there was banners up here sort of, you know, calling for the end of the London connection. People yelling, what do we want? Freedom from London, when do we want it now? Those sorts of things. And I think what they're really feeling is some big boy bully tactics. And they also feel that they've been pulled out of the EU against their will. And at the end of the day, you know, the Scots tell me today that, you know, they really appreciate and value freedom of movement, the investments that the EU brings to Scotland, all these sorts of things. And they now lose those, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, Sarah, you mentioned an anti-England sentiment there in Glasgow. So the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has spoken about, very, very quickly, a possible second Scottish referendum. Tell me a little bit more about that significance, given this anti-England sentiment and given that they weren't too far away from independence a couple years ago.
Well, that's exactly right. 2014, really, it was only by the narrowest of margins that Scotland did remain in the UK. And I've spoken to a lot of people on the streets today, including SNP, Scottish National Party politicians, as well as Green Party politicians, actually politicians from right across the spectrum. And they feel that perhaps this vote is bringing a groundswell towards a referendum being successful. And the main reason being that, one, you know, Scotland really likes the EU. They want to remain in the EU. So they don't see the point in remaining in the UK if that doesn't give them access to the EU. And look, there's been emergency meetings today in Europe, here in Scotland as well. There'll be an emergency cabinet meeting tomorrow. They're looking at this idea of possibly bringing in another referendum, but also looking if there's other options. Can they still trade with Europe and still have some agreements with Europe while they're outside the EU and then possibly even outside the UK as well?
Okay, Sarah, thanks ever so much for that. Sarah Morice, live there from Glasgow. So, you know, as we mentioned, the decision was centred in London, resented elsewhere in places like Glasgow by those who wanted to remain within Britain. And it has also caused political earthquakes in many, many places, not least of which Brussels, from where John Brain reports.
There's no hiding the fact that we wanted a different outcome of yesterday's referendum.
The line of the European Parliament is quite clear. We are very sad about the decision of the voters in the United Kingdom.
The United Kingdom voting to leave the European Union has sent shockwaves across the bloc. Brussels, Paris and Berlin promised to remain united, just as fears grew that a chain reaction of further referendums could tear the EU apart.
Le vote des Britanniques met gravement l'Europe à l'épreuve. Elle doit montrer dans ces circonstances sa solidité, sa force, en apportant les réponses nécessaires pour maîtriser les risques économiques et financiers du départ du Royaume-Uni.
EU heavyweight Germany said the result was truly sobering.
Mit großem Bedauern müssen wir heute die Entscheidung der Mehrheit der britischen Bevölkerung zur Kenntnis nehmen, die Mitgliedschaft des Vereinigten Königreichs in der Europäischen Union beenden zu wollen.
But in Brussels, not everyone is dismayed by the UK's vote for Brexit.
A glorious day for Europe and a sour day for the European Union. But then the European Union actually slammed the door in the face of Mr. Cameron when he asked for reforms.
Make no mistake, this is a full-blown crisis for the European Union, one which has the potential to threaten its very existence. Over the coming days, weeks and months, the world will be watching to judge its response.
One thing there does appear to be agreement upon is that reform is crucial and that carrying on with business as usual is no longer an option. John Brain for the Newsmakers in Brussels.
And John joins us now live from Brussels. John, do you get a sense from the decision makers in Brussels that they have a plan for how they will manage this process with Britain and also how they might deal with any political fallout and contagion across the continent?
In a word, no, Imran. I think they're actually divided on how they think Britain should be treated. It was interesting today that we had rival statements almost from Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, and Martin Schulz from the European Parliament. Mr. Tusk talking in very moderate terms about what would happen to Britain, about how everything would stay the same for 2 years, implying it would be a very smooth transition, a very smooth exit from the EU. And then Martin Schulz really talking like a spurned lover, saying, if you're going to go, go now. We're not going to wait and negotiate. So I don't think there is a plan yet for Britain, that there's possibly years of negotiations even after this 2-year window before a full trading agreement is in place. As for the political contagion, I think they have realized that there is this disconnect between ordinary citizens and the establishment. That certainly seemed to be the case in the UK, and it seems to be something that's happening across Europe. It's interesting that recent polling research found that 48% of people in Britain were not satisfied with the European Union, and yet Britain has voted to leave. The figure in France is 61%. So there is a clear realization that they have to do something, and something quite radical, if they're going to prevent other countries wanting to follow suit.
Angela Merkel, clearly not happy as well. How has she managed her messaging in the aftermath of the vote, given Germany's importance to the European Union?
Well, I think she's found herself in a fairly difficult position as they're really the driving force of the European Union. She considers Britain as a very important part of that bloc. In fact, Germany in recent years has been moving a little bit away from France. There used to be this Germany-France axis, and looking more towards Britain, but they have fallen out over things like the refugee crisis. She tried to get a better deal for David Cameron when he came here to negotiate, but was thwarted to some extent. And she is going to have, as really the leader in many ways of Europe, she is going to have a pivotal role to play in cementing the union together, really. It's a critical time for the EU and a critical time for all its players.
Yeah, critical time indeed. John, thank you so much for that update live from Brussels. Well, let's go back now to our two guests, Denis MacShane and Alex Deane. Alex, for many in Brussels, they're undoubtedly freaking out. You would expect that. John mentioned that they recognize that there's a disconnect between the citizens of nations and the establishment. Might that mean that the European Union is reformable in your eyes?
I think the EU is fundamentally unreformable, and I think that's one of the reasons that we are leaving it. If I put it another way, if the Prime Minister had come back from the negotiating table with more substantial reforms, it would have made the job of the Leave campaign a great deal more difficult. I don't really know anyone who would pretend that the Prime Minister, when he came back with his so-called package of improved special relationship deal arrangements from Brussels, I don't know anyone that says, well, you know, I was going to vote to leave, but that swung me to vote to remain.
Is Britain recoiling from the world?
No, of course not. Britain wants to be a global trading nation. Of course, we're WTO members, NATO members. We want to have more trade deals around the world. And I'll tell you one other thing. I don't think that we should have an immigration system in this country that prefers an unskilled person from within the EU to a skilled person from outside it. I can hear Denis puffing away, but my point is that, in my view, that's effectively a racist policy. Why should we prefer, for argument's sake, a builder from Poland over a doctor from Pakistan? There's no fundamental reason that we should make the doctor's journey to this country a great deal harder. And in fact, I imagine that a large number of ethnic minority people in this country voted to leave the European Union for that very reason. Second, third generation migrants from the Indian subcontinent who found that their families were being treated differently from Eastern Europeans who had their families here.
Denis, I know you couldn't fully hear what Sarah Morice was saying in Glasgow, but a lot of people are angry, a lot of anti-English sentiment there, a lot of people almost saying, hey, if I was on the fence in the past, maybe I'd vote to break away now. Does that mean Scotland's done within a couple of years? It's gone. It's an independent nation, and it might couple up with the EU again?
I'm nervous. I was born in Scotland, a lot of Scottish family there. I'm delighted by the idea I might be able to have a European passport again and be able to travel freely because...
They'd never join the Euro, though, would they?
Well, I mean, the Euro is just an exchange mechanism. Stop fetishising it, frankly.
You're required to join it.
No, stop fetishising it. Yes, they can join it. It's actually an exchange mechanism. It's a unit of value.
Scots would never join it.
Oh, okay, as you wish. I think that in Scotland there will be a lot of upset. Again, the English have decided and dictated to them. That does provoke resentment. And I fear that, yes, we're going to live through a lot of bitterness. This is never David Cameron's intention. I believe he's a unifying figure. He's done wonderful things in respect of gays and lots of other liberal measures. He's rejected ugly, toxic Thatcherism, as it were. But on this, he didn't know what he was unleashing. I wish he consulted more widely, listened to George Osborne, who I expect will also have to resign quite shortly. We're going to have and it's the nasty Tory party that's what Theresa May called them. We're the nasty party. It's the toxic Tories who will be back quite soon. Unfortunately, we've got a Labour Party that frankly isn't in any position yet to offer itself as an alternative government.
Agreed.
So I think politics is going to be very messy and complicated with these tensions and nationalisms rising to the fore.
Tensions and nationalisms, politics getting messy. So you have Scotland, and they might have another referendum anytime soon. Ireland, maybe Sinn Féin's had their say. Are we going to see the issue of Northern Ireland, or possibly the aspirations for a united Ireland, kick off again?
I don't see that happening anytime soon. Of course, there is a land border, but there are many people in Northern Ireland who voted to leave the European Union, just like those of us in England. And of course, many people in Northern Ireland are profoundly and proudly British, and that's one of the defining characteristics of the culture in that part of the world. But on the Scottish point that you were making, I'd also make the point many Scots voted to leave the European Union, and furthermore, voting about whether or not you want to be in the EU is a different test and a different question as to whether or not you want to leave the UK.
of voters in Scotland said we want to remain.
I'm surprised it was that big. I thought there was more Euroscepticism. I'm worried about perhaps smaller peripheral issues. For example, the Spanish politicians say, right, that's it, we'll shut the frontier with Gibraltar.
They shut that all the time.
No, they haven't. They haven't done that since we've been working together in the EU. On the Falkland Islands, all of Europe backs Britain in the UN and everywhere else against Argentina. That's gone away, so Spain and Italy might start playing games. Our standing around the world, we've become little England,
You
Britain.
think Spain and Italy might assist Argentina in a conflict over the Falklands?
No, I'm saying they're references to different committees. This is the small change of diplomacy that can cause real problems when you get it wrong.
So here's a man who was at the table with the Europeans saying our standing is being diminished. You don't
Oh, it's terrible. Americans must
We
be
are
going
represented
through
at
the
many
roof.
top tables by the European Union rather than representing ourselves. How can we diminish our status when we've given up our place to the EU?
I've got to wrap very soon. It's going to be a hard out, so I might have to interrupt one or both of you. The next Prime Minister will be who?
I don't think it'll be Boris Johnson for the reasons I gave earlier. Beyond that, I don't really know, but I think it'll be not a person, a man or a woman, actually, who has been as good as David Cameron. How interesting. Our last three Tory Prime Ministers, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, David Cameron, have all finished their term in office, being destroyed by the European Union because they haven't known how to handle it.
Interesting point. Alex Deane, who's going to be the next Prime Minister?
Someone who campaigned to leave the European Union.
And your preference would be?
I think they've got a series of good candidates. I think Michael Gove's a very clever man. I think Boris has got the lead right now.
Has politics fundamentally changed in the United Kingdom today?
Absolutely. And the biggest change in my view is in the Labour Party, which has seen a big chunk of its natural votes voted contrary to its leadership's wishes and align itself further and further towards UKIP. I think that's the biggest challenge for one of the two major parties.
Should Jeremy Corbyn resign?
No, UKIP will disappear. There's no reason for them to exist anymore.
I've got to get out very soon. Jeremy Corbyn, does he need to resign?
Doesn't matter because Jeremy Corbyn's not going to become Prime Minister.
Okay. We agree with that.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure, Denis MacShane and Alex Deane. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us on this special coverage of the Newsmakers Live from London. It's been an absolute pleasure reporting on this story on this historic day. We close with some of the most striking images from a vote that will undoubtedly change Britain and perhaps Europe forever.